Hey everybody, I'm really glad you found Suncrest Messages. I do hope you'll take a minute to subscribe to either our podcast or our YouTube channel. And you can also download the Suncrest app. There's great stuff there that goes far beyond these messages. Either way, I hope that the next 30 minutes helps you integrate faith with your life. Enjoy.
How's everybody doing today? Good, you look good, lots of celebrations. Awesome to have the kids up here, isn't it? And baptisms, friends of baptizing friends, it's awesome. We have a couple more baptisms in the 10:30 service today. The title of this message today is called Pick a Fight. Pick a Fight. And I'm pretty sure I've never done a message before where the title was Pick a Fight. There's lots of reasons for that, but one of the reasons I'm titling this one Pick a Fight today is because I think that if you and I would be willing to step into some of the awkwardness that is conflict in our relationships, that it actually could move the relationship to a place well beyond where it is right now. And so I use the concept of pick a fight, meaning two things. One is choose a fight. I want you to walk out of here today thinking about a conflict that you need to begin. That you know there is no progress without conflict, and so you're willing to go through some conflict in order for a relationship to be better. I want you to choose someone to pick which fight you'll have. Of course, pick a fight also just means start one. To start a fight. And I really want you to think about the idea that your responsibility is simply to engage a conflict. Sometimes when you hear pick a fight, you might think of it as like, that's going to be an explosion. That's going to be something big and massive. But pick a fight, maybe the better image is striking a match. Knowing that there has to be some friction in order to get to some light and some heat in order to provide something powerful and beautiful. And so I'm going to ask you today to pick a fight. And you might think, why in the world would my pastor ask me to pick a fight? It's not a complicated answer. It's because I see many relationships these days that are stale or they've settled. I encounter lots of married people who are still married, but that's about all they have to say for their marriage. There is no intimacy, and I'm not talking physical intimacy, although it could certainly include that. It's just any life or vibrancy to that relationship had diminished long ago, and nobody's fighting for it. I run into people all the time who have friends, but by friends, they're really acquaintances. And I don't know if this is unique to the world we live in today, but I find that lots of people couldn't even name to me one true friend. Someone who they've been through the fire with. Someone who's had a relationship that's been refined. Someone they know they can trust because they've been through a conflict together. And I want you to have those kind of relationships. Probably the key indicator to me that people are unwilling to step into necessary conflicts is that I hear people complain. I mean, complaining in America today is just kind of our sport that we do, right? But I want you to think about yourself. I've tried to think about myself this week and think, but who do I complain about? And I don't mean politics or news or anything like that. I mean relationships in our lives. I hear people complain about their spouses and their boyfriends and their girlfriends and their parents and their kids and their bosses and their employees. And I'm just going to say this to you. I don't have any respect for people who complain. The Bible says, do everything without complaining. And so whenever I start to hear someone complain about a relationship that's in their life, I always have one question for them. I always just say, well, have you talked to them about it? Have you talked to them about it? Don't talk to me about it until you've talked to them about it. And most of the time, the answer is, no, I haven't talked to them. And then when people start to work through it a little bit, they'll justify their answer, and it'll usually go something like this. No, I haven't talked to them about it because they wouldn't even listen. And then you know what I say to them? I say, so have you talked to them about how they don't listen? Have you addressed it with them directly rather than talking about them and talking about why you won't talk to them? And it's so powerful to me. I have seen people who are willing to engage in some tension, engage in some conflict, to pick a fight, if you will, and then seen those relationships flourish in ways they never would have done if someone wasn't willing to step into what was awkward. And I think that's part of what Jesus was saying in the verse that I shared with you last week, and I want to share with you again this week. Here's what he says. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. He says, you try to save your life, you'll lose it. You try to build a safe life, you'll actually just have a small life. You try to preserve your relationships without any conflict, and you'll end up with relationships that are dead and stale and settled. But if instead you had the willingness to step in and raise the tension, to strike the match, to create enough friction, to start this to potentially go somewhere, it could be so powerful. And when people are unwilling to do this, the reason they end up in small lives are because they're unwilling to step into those awkward conversations. It's possible that some of you are still single today because you wouldn't step into an awkward conversation. It's possible that some of you have mildly frustrating relationships with extended family, and they're just going to stay mildly frustrating because no one's willing to step into the awkward conversation. It's possible that most of us see the aim of our life as avoiding conflict, and so we never actually have the conversation that could move something to a relationship that's rich and beautiful. When I was beginning to plan for this message back in August, there was a statistic that came out. This was wild to me. It said that 23% of parents now pay their children to get off their devices. 23% of parents now pay their children to get off their devices. Now, some of you are sitting there like, that's crazy, right? Actually, aren't we all sitting here saying, that's crazy? But some of us who are saying that's crazy are the very people who are doing it. 23% of people, because they don't want to engage in a conflict or a discipline, somehow we reward our kids for doing things they ought to actually do. And you might think, well, I don't pay them, but that doesn't mean you don't give them something, you don't negotiate it, so that, because sometimes you just have to step in to say, no, it's not going to be that way. I see this at the end of life for people. I'm an enormous fan of hospice care. Hospice has served my family well. I've seen it serve so many families well. But in order to step into the hospice program, which cares for families and provides care and provides financial, does all those things, in order to get into that program, you have to acknowledge that someone's dying. And a lot of times I see families that are just not willing to have the conversation to say, listen, we're at the end. Let's acknowledge it. Somebody has to bring that up so that you can get into the place where you're receiving care. I had a conversation a number of years ago with someone who leads in a hospice program, and he told me that ideally people would get to spend weeks or months in hospice care, but the average length of a stay in hospice care is about 36 hours. Because it's not until the very end, when it's obvious to everyone, that people are willing to have the conversation. And I'm encouraging you today to think in these terms. What would it look like to be the person in my relationships who's willing to go there in a conversation, to strike the match, to create a little bit of conflict so that it can go to someplace beautiful? So I have this question for you. This message is built around 3 questions. Here's the first one. First is who. And I want you to think about who you need to pick a fight with. These relationships are less than I wish they were. Now, I need to be very clear about this. I have a very specific lane for the relationships that I'm talking about today. So let me describe to you the relationships I'm not talking about today. Some of you have relationships that are beautiful, they're rich, they're flourishing, they're marked by laughter, and it's just awesome. Don't start fights with those relationships, okay? Like, let them be awesome, okay? That's awesome. Also, almost all of us have at least a few relationships in our life that are totally toxic. They're marked by terms like hate or abuse or things like that. That is not who I'm talking about today in this message. There's a different message. There's lots of important ways you should handle those relationships. I'm just saying it's not this message today. But I believe there's a really wide lane in the middle of those two relationships. Relationships that are just less than they could be. And we all know about these relationships. There are relationships where there's a mild level of frustration, where there's been, not a big grudge, but something happened and it just kind of sits out there and nobody's talking about it. It's the relationship in your life where you think, I could bring that up, but maybe, I don't know. And then it just flattens out the relationship. And I really want you to think about all of your relationships and choose one today where you'll pick a fight. Let me go through some categories of places where this might happen. It might happen at work. And you should stop and think, okay, with my boss, or maybe you are a boss, with my employees, or maybe it's with my peers. Maybe there's just a relationship that's kind of uncomfortable right now. It's not what it could be. It's less than what it could be. And you might even catch yourself complaining about someone and think, whoever I'm complaining about, that's who I should just engage this conversation with. It very possibly could be at work. It might be in your family. It might be with a spouse. It might be with a child. It might be with a sibling. It might be with a parent. It might be an extended family. But all of us have relationships in our families, don't we, that they're fine, I guess. But they could be so much more. Or maybe there's a different category. This could be people in your neighborhood. It could be the coach of your kids' soccer team. It could even potentially be a cause for you. The kind of cause where you look at a situation and you say, that's not right, and I'm going to pick a fight with it. I loved Cindy's story that she told just before the message. Jenny and I are foster parents, and we've decided, hey, we're going to kind of pick a fight with that broken part of the world. We're going to be willing to step into it. I don't know what it is for you, but if you can't think of a specific, if you're so fortunate in your life that you don't have a specific relationship you need to address this with, then you absolutely have the bandwidth to find a cause to pick a fight with. See, I've done a lot of weddings over 20 plus years of being a pastor. We have an amazing, if you get married through our Suncrest system, this is awesome. Like we have mentor couples that do pre-marriage stuff. It's way better than when you would just used to sit in my office and I'd talk with you about your relationship. But I had a practice I would do with premarital couples. Now, this is about premarital couples, but it's just about all of us in our relationships that I would always do before people get married. Let me describe this to you. I did this with some of you. I would always read through 1 Corinthians 13. It's a chapter that describes the love of God. It's beautiful. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It's not self-seeking. It's a beautiful passage. There's depending on how you count, about a dozen or 15 qualities in there that marks what real love is. And I would always have the potential husband, the potential wife sit there, and I'd say, all right, look at that list, and I want you to talk to me about your partner. And first, I want you to pull one thing out of the list that they're awesome at. Like you get to just say, you know what? You are the most patient person on the face of the earth. You get to affirm them right here while we're sitting together. The good news is always awesome, right? But you know where this is going. And then I would say to them, all right, I want you to pick one quality out of the list, like, because your partner isn't perfect, right? We can all agree on that. Your partner's not perfect. Like, just pick the one they need to grow in the most. And say it out loud to them. And you can imagine the conversations I would have with people at that stage. I mean, it was a whole range, because some people were like, this is my chance. I now get to address the thing I've been, and like are they ready? Like, can I say 3? Can I say 4? No, 1. Just 1. I just want you to engage 1. But a lot of times, especially people who are getting ready to be married, one or the other of the couple, they'd kind of giggle like, oh, there's nothing wrong with him. Oh, she's perfect. I can't even come up with one in this list that they need to grow in. And I'd always think, well, we're going to do 3 extra sessions of counseling for this couple. Because if you can't address a deficiency with someone you're trying to have a rich relationship with, it's going to be a long road. And it's going to be stale in the end. So, who is it for you? Who is it for you? One of the things when we talk about walking, this is the whole inspiration of this series, when you say walking through the other side of awkward, you think, where does that happen in the scriptures, right? And let me give you the honest answer to this. When I talk about needing to take a step of faith, needing to take a risk, needing to engage in a conflict, I don't have any trouble finding the examples in this book because every example in this book, that's how it ended up in this book. Because it was meaningful, because no progress is made without conflict, because great things, like lame things don't get recorded in this book. Great things get recorded in this book, and all great things go through awkwardness. And even when you pin it down to relationships where you should engage a little bit of conflict, like over and over again, like you could just follow this. Like, think about what happened in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve sinned and God wanted to engage them. What did they do? They hid. They just wanted to avoid the awkwardness. You can go through the story. Moses, he stands up in front of Pharaoh. Someone had to do it and say, let my people go. There is no progress without conflict. David, who is an amazing man and also a horrible man, who had an affair and then killed the husband of the lady he had the affair with, he thought he was going to get away with it, but he had a good friend named Nathan. And Nathan came to him and said, David, we got to talk about this. And it led David away from justifying his decision and instead led him to repentance, where he was committed to making things right with God and others. You can go to the life of Jesus and, the stories he tells the story of the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son had said to his dad, I wish you were dead, give me my half of the inheritance, walked away, ends up penniless and in a famine, and he has to decide in his mind, am I going to try to walk back into that relationship with my dad? And the choice of, am I going to go there? It's going to be awkward. I'll just ask him for a job. I won't ask him to be his son again. You can hear it. He actually tells the story. He rehearses his story on the way back to his dad. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But he's going to go there. He's going to have the conversation. And then it ends up beautiful. Actually, when Jesus had all of his interactions, the ones that we have recorded are all the meaningful ones where there's some conflict. And he'll call out Pharisees and teachers of the law and religious leaders. And Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, the leader of the disciples, was, I think, the leader because he was willing to speak up about things. In Matthew 16, he spoke up about something wrong. And Jesus actually said to Peter, he said, get behind me, Satan. This is what I mean. You got to strike the match. You have to start the conflict. You have to pick the fight. Because it's actually through that you get somewhere that can be beautiful and powerful. When Jesus tried to wash Peter's feet in the upper room, Peter's like, no, not my feet. And he's like, I'm going to wash your feet. He's like, then wash my whole body. Jesus is like, no, not that, Peter. Jesus said, somebody's going to deny me. Peter says, no, not me. I'm not going to deny you. And he denies him. There's just this real open willingness to have some friction in the relationship. And then get this, after Jesus died and rose again on the third day, what did he do with Peter? Did he say, hey, I'm just going to sweep that one under the rug that time you denied me there? Maybe that's what you think Jesus would do. He's just a nice guy who would never engage a tough or conflicting conversation when you didn't. No, that's not who Jesus is. Jesus said, yeah, we're going to have to talk about that. And they did. And they reconciled. It was beautiful. Later on in the story of the church, I don't know if you know this story. Peter was a leader in the church, and one of the realizations that came to him that was kind of tough for him to grasp was that the church wasn't just for Jewish people. Followers of Jesus weren't just going to be part of the crowd of Jewish people, which the old covenant had been, but this was now for everyone. And so Peter kind of had to work through this on his own at first to say, hey, this isn't just about my religious crowd and following the rules that I grew up with, but this is for everyone, and they don't actually have to follow all the rules we used to have to follow. And God gave Peter an experience where he saw this story of Cornelius. You can read about it in the book of Acts, and Peter's mind was wide open, like, oh, it's everyone, not just Jewish people. But then guess what happened? Then Peter went back, and he started hanging out with his old friends who were Jewish people. And he actually shrunk back a little bit. And even though the message of Jesus is for absolutely everyone, he started hanging back again just in his Jewish circle and started saying, you know what, maybe those guys should follow some of our rules, some of our church rules, our religious rules that we have before they can become. And then there was an instance, it's in the city of Antioch, where Peter has kind of shrunk back, and the Apostle Paul comes along, and Paul says, that is not cool, Peter. I got to strike this match. I got to start this conversation. In fact, Paul actually writes about it when he writes his letter to the Galatian church. This is what he says. He says, but when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face. For what he did was very wrong. He's like, I can't just let this go. I can't just let it be. Christianity isn't about being nice all the time. It's actually about addressing things that aren't right, addressing things that could be better, and being willing to strike the match and pick a fight and choose a conflict so that it can be better. And so face to face, Paul goes to Peter and says, listen, you know this is for everybody. It is not cool to just shrink back and stay because of your social connections, because of what's comfortable for you relationally, just back into your crowd and ask people to follow these extra rules. Now, here's the thing. Anytime you engage in a conflict, there is absolutely the potential it could go right or it could go wrong. When I ask you to pick a fight, I know what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to create tension in a relationship that might take it to someplace beautiful. It certainly can, and it won't get there if you don't create the conflict. But it also isn't always received well. In this particular instance, it's one of the reasons I respect Peter so much. Peter had somebody address him face to face, picked the fight, struck the match, and he knew he was wrong, and he owned it. In fact, get this, later on, when Peter is writing his part of the scriptures, this is after Paul wrote his part, this is what he says about Paul. He says, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote you, he wrote you with the wisdom that God gave him. Now, see, this is just how I know Peter's a better person than I am. All right? Because, if Paul corrected me, I might just avoid writing about that later on, or I might try to take a shot back at him like he did, but Peter didn't do that. Actually, look at this. He says, Paul's letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort. But they do that with the other scriptures. Paul's writing a scripture. They ignore it to their own destruction. And I think part of what he's saying is, thank God for a guy like Paul, who when he was willing to speak up to me, I decided I got to pay attention. I won't ignore it. It would be to my own destruction. And so I want to ask you not just who you'll have this conversation with, but let's pay just a little bit of attention to how this conversation will go. And when you start thinking about the conversation you're going to have, I really hope that you'll pause long enough to pray through your own inclinations. Now, I know whenever the pastor says pray about it, that might seem generic, but I don't mean it generic at all. I am very specifically asking every one of you to pay attention to your own inclinations whenever you're in a conflict, to really pay attention. It's part of your personality. What are you predisposed to do? And literally pray through that so that you don't mess up this conflict. Let me talk about 4 different inclinations that people have. You'll have some of these. I literally put boxes next to them so you could check which ones belong to you, okay? So some of you have an inclination for quiet resentment. Quiet resentment. You are sweep it under the rug kind of people. I'm not going to make you raise your hand right now. But if you know this is true about yourself, that you have the propensity just to take a situation and say, I'm just going to sweep that under the rug. If I lifted up the rug at your house, it'd be like, oh my goodness. Some of you have that propensity. And you're quiet about it. But it doesn't mean it's not inside you still. It actually is building a little resentment toward whoever you've swept it under the rug with. And this is really worth thinking about. There's sections of the scripture. The wisdom of Proverbs says, we should all listen to this, says, usually it's to your glory to overlook an offense. To overlook an offense. Like most of the things we're offended by in this world, we should just overlook it. That's not sweep it under the rug. Sweep it under the rug is what builds resentment. If you still think about it, you still have it in your heart, you didn't overlook it. So we're looking for the kinds of issues here where you've been able to say, I haven't been able to overlook it. It still lives inside of me. I've swept it under the rug. If that's your propensity, pay attention to that as you go into the conflict, because you'll be tempted to shrink back to it. Second, some people have a propensity for half-truths. Half-truths, where you're kind of willing to say what you're thinking. You're willing to say half of what you're thinking, or half of what bothered you, or half of what you wish it were in your relationship. But just saying half of it, and the person who's listening to you is, of course, imagining that you've said all of it, actually only creates a gap in the relationship rather than giving you a chance to work through it. Sometimes in relationships, I call this the last 10%. That if you're going to tell the truth to someone, if you're going to strike a match and create a little bit of a conflict, you have to say it. You have to say all of it. Otherwise, you can't expect someone to respond and work through it. Do any of you have the propensity for just kind of going there? You should absolutely check that box and pray through it. Some of you have a different propensity. This is the propensity for guns blazing. Guns blazing. You know how to have conflict. You're like, bam! Let's get it on. And if that's your personality, you should absolutely check this box and pray through that before you engage the conflict that I'm talking about. Now, here's the wild thing. Some people think people who are guns blazing are never quiet resentment. But it's absolutely possible that you should be checking both of these boxes. Because lots of people sweep things under the rug until it's too much, and then they just explode. What is guns blazing? Well, guns blazing is coming in anger, coming with a temper, coming with an accusing tone. Oh yeah, we need to have this conversation because you and you and you. Making a list. Don't be that person. When you think about engaging the conflict so that you can have a great relationship, don't blow it up. You pray through that propensity that you have. Some of you have the propensity to be a control freak. And here's how control freak shows up in conflicts and relationships. Control freak means I'm frustrated with you, or I think it's kind of stale. And so I'm going to start to picture how this conversation is going to go when I engage the conflict. And then I have a very specific way this needs to go for me to consider it successful. That's what control freaks do. They actually start to focus only on the result of the conversation, and it has to hit that precisely to be successful, rather than on the relational give and take of a conversation. You know, in rich relationships where there's relational give and take, there's very little control involved. What there is an openness to learning, an openness to understanding, an openness to the idea that I was probably wrong about some things too. But you're going to step into a situation that is not controllable. That's why it's awkward. And if you're a control freak, you will miss out on the relational give and take where you could learn something because you're so focused on how it has to go. And so I really pray that before you step into striking the match, creating the friction, you'll check yourself first. Say, yeah, I got to get this part right. I got to be aware of this and my propensities. Jesus talked about this. What's the golden rule? Do to others as you would have them do to you. And this is just a little practice before you get into the conversation to say, yeah, what if the shoe is on the other foot? Like in this relationship that's stale or frustrating or maybe has a mild level of grudge, would I want the other person to come to me about it? Would I want them to feel like I'm open enough that I could have a conversation about this, that we could go somewhere? You think about how would I want them to come to me? Boy, if someone comes to me in a relationship, you know what I hope for? I hope they've really paid attention to whether they're sweeping things under the rug, quiet resentment, guns blazing. Like I hope they've thought about all that. and they come with a learning and humble posture. In the same way I want them to do that to me, that's the way I'll do this with others. In Ephesians, we mentioned this a few weeks ago, it just says, speaking the truth in love, we will grow. That's actually how growth happens. Whoever you're going to start this fight with, you have to say the truth. You have to. You have to go all the way there, the last 10%, not half of it, all of it. And they have to know you love them. If you try to have a truth conversation without love, it will go wrong. If you have to try to have a loving conversation without some truth, it'll be stale. If you have this conversation perfectly, where you tell the truth and you are loving, it could still go wrong. That's why it's awkward. But we decide in these relationships that I'm not content to keep living on this side of awkward, to keep tapping out when a tough conversation comes up, and just live in this relationship that's lame, instead of having the chance for it to go somewhere and thrive. So how do you do this? You proceed through the awkwardness. And there's a couple principles around this that I just want to share with you before you have it. Here's the first one. You have to be direct to the person. Do not complain about your boss, your employee, your mother, your mother-in-law, your son. Do not complain about them to others. You speak directly to them. That's where the respect is. And you have to be specific on the issue. Here's where I find many crucial conversations go wrong. We are frustrated about a particular instance or issue of something that happened, and then we think about it so much and almost meditate it, worry about it on ourselves, that in our own minds, we move it from being an issue and we start to categorize it as someone's identity. This is how we start to think about it. I wrote some of these down. I think, oh, they dropped the ball. They dropped the ball. And then somehow in my mind it goes to not just they dropped the ball, but they're an irresponsible person. We think, I think that person just said something that wasn't true. I should address that. But I let it float around in my mind long enough, and it goes from them saying it wasn't true to me deciding, you know what, they're a liar. That's who they are. We move off the issue and we create a whole identity around them. People are frustrated that maybe their mate isn't as open or isn't as affectionate or isn't as appreciative as they wish they were. And you could look at an instance and talk about that particular instance. But sometimes people let that filter around in their mind, and all of a sudden they get to the place where they think, you know what, the person I'm married to, they're self-absorbed. And we put it in a whole identity rather than an issue. And this is what I'm saying. When someone doesn't come for Christmas and it bothers you, you should ask them why they didn't come for Christmas. You shouldn't ask them why they're not a good family person. If you're going to engage a conflict, you absolutely should narrow it down to the smallest, most specific, most tangible example that you have and just talk about the issue, not about what you've concluded about someone's identity out of the issue. This is how Jesus said it. He said, go and point out their fault. Go and point out the situation. Go and point out the experience. Go and point out just between the two of you. Other part of proceeding through the awkwardness, you got to be conscious of your limitations. So I'm asking you to pick a fight. And when you do that, it's going to create a situation that is not completely controllable by you. And to begin knowing, I can't control all this. I understand my limitations is absolutely critical. Anytime there's a relational issue that's happening in people's lives, I give you this framework pretty often. Think about this. There's your part. There's their part, the other person's part. And there's God's part. There's your part, there's their part, there's God's part. You have control over one of those three. And these fights go wrong when I try to control the other two. What does God do? God's the only one who can change a human heart. If I think at the end of this conversation I have to have changed their heart, it's a loss from the beginning. I have to control their behavior, their response, it's a loss. There's their part, there's God's part, there's your part. It's toxic when you try to do God's or their part. And by the way, it's also toxic when you don't do your part. Paul said it this way. He said, I've watered the seed, or I planted the seed, but it's God who's making it grow. So here's my question. Third question. When? Who, how, when? And I have 7 options for you for when. And this isn't like, any Wednesday. This is this Wednesday. I have another whole awkward thing I want to introduce you to next week. You got to be done with this one. You have to do this one before we start the next one next week. And frankly, if the relationship is stale or settled or frustrating or mildly grumbling, why in the world would you wait? So I'm asking you today to decide in your heart right now when you're going to engage this week. Which day of the week will it be? And then maybe even before you walk out this room, with the person you have in mind, you should just text them. And here's what you should say. You should say, hey, could we have a meaningful conversation this week? Hey, could we have a meaningful conversation this week? I'm trying to help you set the tone in the right way. Not too high, but not too low, so that you can find a time to pick a fight. Let me pray about it. God, I really want to pray over this because if we take you seriously and we want life to be better, then there's going to be lots of conflict this week from the people in this room. And so, God, I pray for our own self-awareness, engaging those, and I pray for you to do your part and for the people we want to engage to want it as bad as we want it and be willing to work through it in order to get there. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, I really hope that was helpful for integrating faith with life. Listen, if you're in Northwest Indiana, I'd love to have you join us in person. Head over to suncrest.org and plan your visit.